in this section here. Okay, I was going to say we talk about Bowlby first, and then we talk about Ainsworth on the sort of introduction slide, but we actually introduce Ainsworth's strange situation paradigm first because we actually use this paradigm in order to talk about Bowlby's attachment styles. So this here is the basics of the strange situation paradigm. And for this, again, the stages and what happens at each stage is unimportant. What we care about is the fact that this situation or this design is set up so that you have a child and their parent or guardian. Usually when it was originally conducted, it was all children with their mothers, but any parent can do in today's world. So they have a child and parent come in, they do the basics of sort of agreeing to participate in the study, they hang out in a room. For developmental research, they typically have some comforting room with lots of toys, lots of things for the child to do. And then the parent and the child are able to wander around, play with things, do whatever they want for a set amount of time. Then we'll have a stranger come in. So a researcher or somebody who's working with the researcher will come in, interact with the child or the parent, and then leave. And the point here is that we're watching what the child does anytime a change occurs. So once the parent leaves and the child is left with a stranger, you'd see how they react in that situation. So are they scared of this stranger? Are they comfortable interacting with them? What are they doing? We also look at how they react to their parent leaving. So are they distraught at being left alone, or are they okay with it? Do they trust that their parent's coming back? We then have some reunions where the parent will come back and you see how the child reacts to the parent returning, and so on and so forth. So there's all sorts of interactions, all sorts of changes, and we evaluate what does the child do in each of these different scenarios. And then from that reaction, what does that tell us about how this child interacts with their world? So that's where we get into our attachment styles here. And so we have 4 major attachment styles. I will let you know that the last of these, the disorganized attachment, this is actually their error term or their catch-all. These are the children where we're like, they're not showing a consistent pattern and they're not fitting into any other category, so we're going to stick them here. So these children all have very odd behavior. So they might be upset that their parent's leaving. They might also be upset that their parent has come back. They might be indifferent. It's nothing consistent. But for the other ones, we're mainly going to compare secure versus insecure attachment styles. And our secure attachment style is when the child is able to adjust to the parent leaving and coming back. So they're not necessarily completely fine. They don't ignore their parent when they leave. They're usually a little bit upset that they're being left behind, but they're very quickly going to come to terms with it. They're going to go and play by themselves. They're able to be calm and controlled when left to their own devices. When their parent returns, they're going to be happy that they're back, but again, they're not going to be like clingy or over the top in getting to reunite with their parent. So this is their healthy approach. They're fine when they leave, they're fine when they come back. They're still happy to see their parent, but it's not as extreme as some of the other categories' reactions. In this situation, this is the most common of our types of attachment, and this is the most stable or healthy of those. In this case, I think this one is about 70% of children fall under this attachment style. So this is a very, very common attachment style. And actually, when we get into our discussion on attachment styles in adulthood, we start seeing that our childhood attachment styles or infancy attachment styles end up correlating very strongly with how we interact with relationships as adults as well. And there's a whole bunch of factors that get involved here, but those who have sort of this secure infancy, they're having healthy reactions with their parents, they tend to also have healthy relationships as adults. For our insecure types here, these are when children are less healthy in their interactions with their children. So our insecure, resistant children are the ones who really, really don't want to be separated from their parent. So this is a child where if their parent has to leave the room, they're going to cling to them. They're going to cry. They're going to be distraught when they're out of the room. And when they come back, they're going to be attached to their parent. They want to cling to their skirt. They want to hold on to their leg. They want to be held. They want interaction. And this is something, once again, carries through to adulthood. Children with this attachment style often grow up to be adults who are overly clingy in their relationships. They tend to be very needy, and they tend to be constantly worried that their partner might leave them. The next one being our insecure avoidant attachment style. This is when the parent leaves and the child is indifferent, and the parent returns and the child is still indifferent. So they really don't care if the parent is present or not. They're mainly self-sufficient. And again, as you get older, this becomes people who are sort of fiercely independent, don't want relationships with others, and very much only want to rely on themselves. There are some theories that look at these two types of insecure attachment and actually relate them to some other aspects of their upbringing. So specifically, the insecure resistant one is theorized to occur when you have parents who would really, really like to be spending time with their children. They'd really like to devote resources to their children, but for whatever reason, they are physically incapable of doing so. So this would be environments where, say, a parent has to be out of the house for long periods of time. So maybe your parent is a long-distance trucker, and so they're only home a few days out of the month, and so you know that they love you and care for you, but they're physically not present. So in that case, children will want to spend as much time with their parents as they can when they're there, because they know that for long stretches they won't have access. This can also happen if, say, there are too many children and parents don't have enough resources or enough time to spend with each of them one-on-one. They can become clingy for that reason as well. But the distinction here, we're saying that the parents want to spend this time with their children, but they are physically incapable of it. In contrast, the insecure avoidant attachment style is usually when parents don't spend resources on their children, not because they can't, but because they choose not to. And in those situations, it would be maybe parents that didn't want kids or don't want to interact with their kids or find them inconvenient. And in those cases, the children learn to be very independent, and they learn not to trust or rely on others. And those patterns carry forward into their future relationships, like we said. Those are sort of an extension of this theory that was added on later. I just know it because we talk about it in one of my evolution of human behavior lectures. But I thought it'd be interesting to point out why some of these might develop. And a lot of it just comes down to, from experience, what do these children expect from social relationships? And then how does that affect their expectations of social relationships in the future? We make general assumptions that things will continue as we've seen them in the past. All right, and yeah, we already did that the disorganized is the ones that don't fit into any of the categories, so we are good on that count. All right. And so our last section here on, I think it's the last for the childhood development stuff, is moral development. So as promised, we get to swing back and talk about Kohlberg. And so Kohlberg's stage theory for moral development, more stages, we get to talk about a bunch of different levels that are divided up into subcategories. So they have 3 levels with 2-ish substages each. For whatever reason, we end up looking at 5 instead of 6, because whatever. But for our first level, because we don't really care about all the substages, the first level is pre-conventional reasoning. And this is when we're younger, and a lot of our judgments of what is right and what is wrong really just comes from experience and stuff that you've encountered from trying things out. So if you did something and got punished for it, that thing is now labeled as wrong in your mind. If you do something and get praised for it, then that's the right thing to do. So a lot of our judgments of good and bad, right and wrong, comes from our parents and our own experiences. So we really don't have any internalized moral values. We're really not thinking for ourselves at this point. We are relying on other people to say, you can do this, you can't do that, and those are the rules that we follow. Afterwards, we get into our conventional reasoning stages, and here, now we're going to start looking at basing our own morals on some of the standards or expectations within our groups. So we typically start off with having similar morals to our parents, and that's because that's what we're exposed to. But as we start getting into the age where we're in school and have larger friend groups, we start basing a lot of our judgment on conformity to expectations of our peer groups. So right and wrong are now going to be based on what is my group going to react positively to or negatively to. So we adopt some other person's values and make them our own. So this is usually when people are trying to fit in, and they're going to adjust their behaviors according to whatever fits you in that particular group. So this can be, I'm doing whatever my peers say is right or wrong. It can still be a little bit of following your parents' rules. It could be that you're following whatever moral guidelines are set out by whatever religion you follow. All of that is coming from some external source. And then our last stage is the post-conventional reasoning stage. And here, our moral judgments are going to be based on our own consciousness. So now we're going to think about things and what feels right or wrong to me. So it can often start from, say, whatever morality we got from our religion or parents or peers, but we're going to have our own input now. We're going to say, well, I don't necessarily agree with this aspect, so I'm going to change that rule for myself. So now all of these ideas, all of our morals have been internalized and are part of your own unique value system. So you've started to think for yourself, you have things that have meaning to you, and a lot of that can be influenced based on your own experiences. And of course, we can talk pros and cons. Pros being that it's one of the theories that gives us some ideas of where those morals might come from, and they do kind of line up logically with what we often see. As people get older, they tend to think a lot more for themselves and have those ideas of right and wrong based on their own values, things that matter to them. But of course, we have criticisms. There is definitely a bias towards Western culture. So in this, a lot of the questions that would be asked on surveys evaluating your current moral stage, a lot of them are based on Western morality. So this is right, that's wrong, ignoring some of those other rules or determinations that might come from other religions or other cultures. There is also definitely a gender bias. And a lot of this comes from the fact that if you look at priorities between the genders, we often see that females are going to be more predisposed to caring for others or looking externally. And that might be something genetic, it might be something learned through society, where you might have that caretaker role as the assumed basis. And then males would think a lot more about how does this affect me or what is relevant for myself. And so that is definitely something that plays a role here. We also have an issue where a lot of these questions, and they'll do things like pose a moral quandary and say, what choice would you make? So things like, if you know the trolley problem, of if you see a trolley coming and there's somebody on the tracks, and if you pull a switch, then you can move it to a different track where it'll hit differing numbers of people. They have all sorts of modifications of that. And usually the idea being, could you do something to save more people? Could you make an adjustment to cause the smallest amount of harm? And we find some really neat consistencies with people where if the question is, if you do nothing, the smaller number of people would be injured, or if we stage it where you don't have to get involved, people are fine with somebody getting hurt or somebody dying as long as you don't directly intervene. But as soon as we change the situation so that you'd be involved, so you have to pull a switch or you have to push somebody off a bridge, all of a sudden people's logic changes. But the issue that they have with this is with all of the different questions they pose, it's asking you, what would you do? It's not what do you actually do, it's what would you do in response. So it's all about what you think would happen, but not actually looking at real world actions. And so there's a lot of discussion on, well, yeah, people might say that they do this or not do that, but does that apply to their real world behavior? Yes or no?
The last of our slides talking about moral development and specifically Kohlberg's model is looking at all the different stages. So here they've actually broken it down in a kind of unfortunate way. But we've been looking at our 3 different levels, acknowledging that there are 2 substages each within each of these levels. However, this study actually had that last level. They didn't break it down into 2 separate substages, which is why we've ended up with 1 through 5 instead of 1 through 6. But the first 2 being that first level we discussed, the second 2 being our second level, and then the last 1 being our third level. So close, but not quite the same as what we've been talking about. But what I care about here is actually our pattern of what individuals at which ages show which stages of moral development. And so we see that those early stages, the ones where you're mainly focused on environmental feedback and doing what will or won't get you into trouble, those ones die off fairly quickly. So we see that those are fairly high when you're children and they go away into adulthood, though there are some individuals who will persist having some of these moral stages even into their 20s and 30s. But then we also see that the next 2 stages are going to increase as we get a little bit older. So stage 3 gets fairly high when we're getting closer to adulthood, and then it sort of plateaus and tapers off, where stage 4 becomes the dominant and the most common of our moral stages into adulthood. And then interestingly, stage 5, that last level that we talked about, where we have people making up their own decisions, their own values based on their own experiences, that one only starts appearing into adulthood, but it never really gets as common as some of our other stages. So very few people end up progressing all the way to this stage. And that seems kind of counterintuitive because we've been looking at stages so far with that idea of individuals start at the beginning and travel through all of the stages in a predictable format. But for Kohlberg's theories, these were just meant to be sort of different categories. And yes, we do tend to see people progress through them in a similar order. However, we acknowledge that not everyone is going to move through all of these stages. Some individuals may stop at stage 3 or stage 4 and never actually progress to stage 5. It's just neat to see this pattern where we have sort of these different proportions of a population at different ages showing different prevalences of different stages here. But our next section is where we're going to get into some more of our physicality in terms of development. And specifically, we're going to start off talking about our brains, where when we're born, our brains are only about 25% of what they will be when we're adults. And one of the reasons for this, we've mentioned before that head size is something that's constrained by evolution. Specifically, if our heads are too large, then birth mortality tends to go up. So, in order to have maximum survival through that natural selection process, there's sort of a maximum head size that we can have for children leading to successful births. So, their brains are smaller when they're born and then grow fairly rapidly once they're out of the womb. So by 6 months, they're actually 50% of their adult weight, and they're going to continue to grow and increase in weight. Now, we do know that there is still rapid growth, more and more cells being created, lots of neurogenesis, where we end up having sort of our peak amount of neurons and neural connections around that sort of 2 years of age mark. However, a lot of this growth is actually coming from the fact that our cells are becoming larger. So, when we're born, cells have been dividing really, really rapidly in a short amount of time. So there hasn't been tons of time to have lots and lots of that intracellular fluid that's what fills all the gaps within our cells. So once we're born and have time to accumulate different resources, those cells can get bigger. So more surface area for the outside of the cells, more volume on the inside, they take up more space and gain more weight. And as this process goes on, as we have not only more neurons, but larger neurons, they're able to make more and more connections. So that's when we start seeing our neural networks forming as our brains are making these connections. And when we start looking at how those connections form, it matches up with a lot of the patterns we talked about when we were looking at prenatal development, where, again, we focus on things that are key to survival. So we start seeing lots of connections, lots of these interactions forming in and around, say, the brainstem. And eventually we move off into less important things for base survival, but still important for functioning. Things like those association or associative areas within our cortex, stuff that allows us to make connections, to pull information from multiple areas, things like that. So we start with biologically essential and progress towards those that are more useful but not necessary for survival. And once we get into sort of the 5 years of age range, our brains are up to 50% of adult size. So again, still very fast, though it slows after we get right out of birth. And as we get to this adult size, we're still seeing that maturation, still seeing more connections, and that progresses all the way until we're about 25, where we're finally coming into fully matured brains. And like I said, those association areas are the last to finalize. Specifically, we'll see that adults, the prefrontal cortex, that part of our brains right at the front that's responsible for personality and decision making and integrating information, that's the last one to finalize within our brains. But yeah, as this process goes on, we're seeing more connections, but also eventually less connections because we're able to prune extra or redundant connections once we figure out what we do and don't need. So we become more specialized because we've figured out what's essential and we've gotten rid of what is no longer essential. All right, so our next sequence here is looking at motor development. And these are, again, patterns that we're typically going to see. These are still arranged sort of step-like because these things progress earlier and these things come later. And for a lot of these, we have certain stages that are required. So things like being able to stand with support precedes standing alone, and you have to be able to stand in order to be able to walk. So those are sort of requirements that they progress in order, though there are always odd exceptions. So things like, so crawling would fall somewhere in here where you can sort of support yourself with your arms and you can start moving your legs to move across the floor before you start standing and walking. Though there are cases, I think one of my cousins skipped crawling, and so he rolled until he could walk and skipped over crawling entirely. So I always have students ask about exceptions, and there definitely are, but for the most part, we're going to see this kind of progression. And if you're wondering what these bars are, the the start of the bar is where about 25% of children are capable of doing this action. So by 2 months, 25% of babies are able to support themselves with their arms. And by the time you hit 4 months, 90% of children can pass this skill. So that's what our sort of limits are here, is the 25% and 90%. And we see that range because there are definitely individual differences. So some children will physically develop faster than others and develop some of these motor skills sooner than others and get to certain stages faster than others. But these show us those basic patterns. So most of these skills are following those stage-like sequences where we see that natural progression in a predictable way. The age of acquiring these skills definitely varies, hence the bars, and some of these have very large bars, but the sequence seems to be fairly consistent. We do end up with some oddities, and I think I've mentioned these before, and these are those U-shaped functions. So our U-shaped functions are the ones that they exist early on, then they go away for a time, and then they return later on. So the stepping reflex, where if you hold a baby up and give them that chance to step up to a surface, they do it shortly after birth, and then it goes away for a while, and then right around the time that they're ready to start walking, that stepping reflex returns again. We also mentioned that sound localization, turning to orient towards a sound, follows that same U-shaped function where it exists, then doesn't, and then comes back. So we have a couple of these where they have atypical patterns. And I think we've mentioned before that sometimes the theory being that that goes away because maybe that area of the brain is reorganizing or something's going on that prevents it from happening until certain changes have settled down. So it's possible to be one of our explanations there. If we wanted to introduce some environmental and cultural experiences or influences on some of these different stages and development processes, we can look at some of those physical components, things like your diet. So in order to continue growing and supporting multiple changes within our cells and those connections between cells, we definitely need to have all of those nutrients that are going to facilitate that growth. We also can see some patterns where things like being in more enriched environments, being in places with lots of stimuli, lots of sort of resources in terms of like experiences, that leads to having heavier brains, mainly because our density is increasing. We're making more connections. There's more matter crammed into that space because of all those experiences, because we form new connections as we encounter novel situations. We also see that things like physical touch can count as enrichment as part of our environment. And it's actually something that those who don't get to interact with others, we tend to see detriments in terms of their behavior in the long run. So physical touch can be really, really important. In terms of sensory components, we do find that certain lack of exposure can have long-term effects. One of the most famous studies is not in humans, but we can use the idea, but in cats. And what they've done is they've raised cats in environments that lack certain types of stimuli. So they had two groups, and some were raised in environments with vertical lines only, specifically set up so that it was a round room with vertical black and white lines painted on the walls, and even the floor. They didn't allow there to be a horizontal line to match where the sort of walls touch the floor. They inserted a mirror so it looked like those lines continued onward. And so they grew up in this environment with no horizontal lines at all. And then, once they were grown and developed and everything, they looked at their ability to discriminate between different horizontal stimuli, stuff they'd never seen before. And what they found was that the cats had actually lost the ability to perceive horizontal surfaces. So any of the neurons that would have specialized in interpreting horizontal lines instead of just vertical hadn't developed and therefore had been lost. And they did the opposite, only raised in horizontal environments with no verticals. Same thing, they lost their ability to perceive vertical. So deprivation, especially if it covers, say, a critical period, can end up causing permanent detriments in your ability to perceive. So kind of interesting, though, especially for humans where our brains are fairly plastic, at least until middle childhood, those deprivations would probably have to be for quite a long time. Because as we saw in those children who had cataracts and couldn't see at all until 6 months of age, they very rapidly caught up in terms of visual development right after that. So this would only hold if that deprivation lasts longer than that period of plasticity or flexibility within the brain. This slide is just meant to be sort of a overall interpretation or overall idea here. So our general principle saying that our biology sets limits, kind of like our reaction range theory, where we have, say, a range set by our genetics that says you will become, say, this height or that height, or somewhere in this possible range based on whatever genes you got from your parents. However, our environment is always going to play a role. So, our environment can influence where we fall within that range, within those limits set by our biology. And we're then going to see where we fall based on those current experiences. So, our environment can have a very powerful influence, especially if we look at things like lack of exposure to nutrients or resources or whatever. And we also need to keep in mind that these biological and environmental different factors end up overlapping pretty dramatically as well. So we can have our genes influence our environment, but we can also have our environment influence our genes. And for examples, our genes influencing our environment, if we looked at, say, a personality trait like extroversion, someone who is very extroverted might find themselves in more social situations. And then being in social situations, it's affecting our environment, could lead them to encounter, say, additional stressors. Maybe they're around a lot of people and they end up with a very negative self image or something like that. Our environment, of course, can also activate or deactivate certain genes and a whole bunch of other ways of interaction. So, just a few examples in case you're curious. Our next section, we're finally getting into adolescence, and then eventually we'll get into adulthood. But for adolescence here, we're specifying that this is a period that begins at puberty. And so at puberty, we're having a change in all of our sex hormones that are released. And those hormones are then going to cause changes within our physical bodies. So, our brain's hypothalamus is going to signal our pituitary gland. And you might remember the pituitary gland is sort of like the control center for all of our endocrine system. And so we see an increase in secretions of hormones, and mainly those sex hormones. And as that process goes onward, we start seeing our secondary sex characteristics. So things like females developing breasts and starting to menstruate. For males, they're going to have changes in hair patterns of growth and muscles, and sperm production starts to occur. And for this process, we're talking about puberty as sort of this biological change, this biological process. We do make it clear that adolescence, though it starts at puberty, it isn't just puberty. Adolescence is specifically this transition between childhood and adulthood. And technically, if we look at that process, adolescence can change depending on the time period and the environment in which it occurs. And so in some cultures, they would look at childhood and transitioning directly into adulthood, basically saying that as soon as they are capable of reproduction, they should be counted as adults. And there might be rites of passage, certain ceremonies or events that mark that transition. But in other places, we have a much longer period of adolescence. So, especially as we've had changes following the Industrial Revolution, that is tying into the fact that we need a longer period of change. And it started, I mentioned the Industrial Revolution because that was the tipping point where, yeah, they had children who were working in factories far younger than they should have been. But basically, as soon as you were big enough and strong enough to work in a factory or work in a certain environment, you were put to work. But as technology advanced, as things changed, we needed these longer and longer training periods. And specifically, we start seeing the requirement for additional schooling to get that training to then be effective in the workforce. So it became common to have this prolonged period where you're not quite children anymore, but you're not yet fully independent adults. And that transition period gets longer and longer. And to the point of nowadays, where especially if you take, say, multiple degrees in university, then it might not feel like you've started adulthood until you're capable of being on your own. And there are different defining factors that different cultures and individuals will use to decide that you've hit adulthood or not. Though legally, they'll set it as a certain age, usually the age of 18. But these are all products of society and all of those changes, so we can track it back to some of that history as per usual. But if we're seeing all of these different changes internally, we wouldn't be surprised that we're starting to see external changes as well. So a lot of our psychological changes come about because of all of those differences. So some of the psychological consequences that we can look at are things like mood and changes in behavior, where hormones can directly affect our mood because things are changing in terms of the patterns that our bodies are used to. But we can also look at mood affected by how others in our environment treat us. So when we look at sort of males versus females, with males, they typically end up coming into puberty and it tends to be a positive experience. And most research looks at those who hit puberty early versus late. And for males, early puberty means that they get bigger and stronger, and that tends to be things that their peers find really impressive. So tends to be more positive overall. Their friends look up to them. They're sort of more likely to be positively regarded by those around them. The difference comes in when we look at females who mature early. This can actually have some very negative effects for them. So this early maturation can actually lead to them having very negative self-image because those changes and those hormones swinging and the effects on their bodies overall, they typically end up gaining weight. And that awkward transition period can make them feel extra self-conscious. And we'll actually see that the way that their brains work at the time, they feel like they're being watched and judged a lot more than they really are. So a lot of these internal components make them feel very uncomfortable. And that self-consciousness can lead to negative behaviors, things like eating disorders or problems with school or even heightened levels of anxiety overall. So for the most part, the experience tends to be positive for males and fairly negative for females if they end up being hitting that maturity before others of their age. They'll also feel sort of singled out because they're different from everyone else. And if we look at late maturation, that can be problematic on both sides because once again, they'd feel that they are different from everyone around them, and that can make them feel extra self-conscious too. And again, we'll look at some thought patterns in a few slides that help explain why. But if we look at our brains by this stage, our brains have basically matured. We're almost at full adult size, full adult density, things like that. But there are still differences in activation, and there are still going to be more connections formed, of course, because we're having more and more experiences as we get older. So the growth overall has slowed down, where there's very little change in terms of size and number of cells from here onward. But activation changes, connections change. And in fact, if we look at functional MRI, looking at different parts of the brain, they'll find that children have their own distinct patterns, adolescents have their own distinct patterns, and adults have their own distinct patterns. Because once again, our brains are not fully formed, not fully mature until at least mid-20s. So there are definitely differences in terms of those connections. And like I stressed, a lot of these later changes are occurring in the frontal lobes. And those are the areas, again, responsible for impulse control, more abstract reasoning, thinking about consequences of your actions, as well as personality and a whole bunch of other things. So that's an area with lots and lots of associations that pulls a lot of information from other parts of the brain to make these critical determinations. If we look at the non-myelinated gray matter versus our white matter, which is myelinated. So if we've talked about sort of the white matter and gray matter within our brains, we're talking about cell bodies, which are always unmyelinated, being our gray matter, and then our white matter being those myelinated axons. And the axons are how we make connections with other parts of the brain. So we see that with that white matter, it's going to keep increasing and it ends up being sort of peaking in adulthood. So that's why we know that those developmental things in the frontal cortex are coming much later into adolescence and adulthood. But the non-myelinated component, all of those cell bodies, that peaks towards the end of childhood. And the reason here is because we typically don't see a lot of neurogenesis is the word I'm thinking of. We don't have a lot of new neurons being formed, so the cell bodies don't really change. But the connections are what changes as we get older, once we're out of childhood. So that's why we're leaning into this idea that all those changes, all those connections are what are peaking within this period of time in our frontal cortex. In other parts of the brains, we don't see as clear cut of a pattern because there is a lot of connections in those areas because of that pattern we talked about before, where we start with essential areas and then finish with the association areas. That's why this pattern holds here too. And so, like I said before, a lot of this process as we're getting older is getting more specific. That pruning of unnecessary cells is coming about because our experiences lead to certain connections being strengthened and adding new connections where we don't have any, but also getting rid of redundant connections, things that we don't need, things that are duplicates. All of that gets gone. And so this process is showing that changing as we get more experiences as we get older. So all of that pruning, I guess you can specifically say on the slide here, it's allowing for more efficient communication between areas because we've gotten rid of the excess. We've gotten rid of what isn't necessary. And one of those areas that we see massive changes is actually in our corpus callosum. And the corpus callosum is the bridge between our two hemispheres. So if we need to share information from one side of the brain to the other, there's only one place that that crossover can happen. And because there's so much integration of information from both sides, we end up seeing this 10% increase in those connections across that one bridge. So this is a massive amount of increase in that area as compared to other parts of the brain. Now, this next section here, so you've probably heard, it's very commonly discussed in media, that because that prefrontal cortex, that area in our frontal lobe that allows us to evaluate consequences of our actions and inhibit behaviors that maybe would have negative consequences, because that doesn't fully develop until our mid-20s, that's why adolescents are so risky in their behaviors, why they act in certain ways without any thought for consequence because they can't do it at all. However, while yes, we do see that adolescents are more likely to engage in these risk-taking behaviors and not thinking of the consequences of their actions, it isn't only because of this later development of their prefrontal cortex. It definitely plays a role, and it is true that it's developing later on. However, other factors, things like peer groups and expectations of others and things like that, especially starting to experience freedom for the first time, can absolutely affect this as well. So yes, that late prefrontal cortex development is a thing and correlates with those behaviors. We have to consider other factors as well, as per always. And this slide here is where we can talk about those ways of thinking that I mentioned before, things that can make individuals feel, say, the center of attention. So we're getting into egocentrism once again, sort of that focus on the self and being concerned about how others are viewing you and how things affect you. But we have two concepts here. So the overestimation of our unique experiences or feelings is called the personal fable. So a lot of adolescents think that their experiences are special to them. So nobody else has ever fallen in love with this person so hard, or my life is so different from everyone else's. We also have this oversensitivity to social evaluation, and they call that one the imaginary audience. So the idea that everybody is looking at me, everyone is judging me, everyone is going to think poorly of me. So we can see why those would absolutely affect self-image as you're developing. It also kind of makes sense if we look at movies that are, say, designed for teens, or books, basically any kind of media. And in those situations, they like stories that make you feel special, where the main character is unique and important, someone who's worthy of keeping everyone's attention. And that can, these can kind of explain why that might be so appealing. And in fact, this egocentrism, this self focus, can actually be part of that engagement in risky behaviors because they feel special and unique, and possibly leading them to feel invulnerable or exempt from certain consequences. So there's lots of these factors that can absolutely be tied back to that idea. But this has us back on that cognitive development track that we had left off looking at with children, and we should be unsurprised that we're seeing that increase in our abstract reasoning abilities. If you remember, when we talked about Piaget, we said that the final step that we talked about there was technically adolescence. So that formal operational stage is that abstract reasoning. So it gets to come back here once again. So yeah, abstract reasoning is our critical point here. And we also have more flexible and more creative thinking because of that, where they can think of possibilities that they might not have encountered before. They can imagine scenarios that they might not have observed. And so once they hit that formal operational thought stage, they can start using deductive reasoning in order to solve their problems systematically. So try this. If it doesn't work, we can eliminate it. Try that. And if that doesn't work, we eliminate that and try something else. And so this is why we're seeing here that idea of being scientifically minded. And so this this example here was looking at how children might be able to solve a problem looking at pendulums and sort of the different lengths of string and how far it would have to swing. And I think it was one of those, like, you want it to release at a certain point and then fly a certain distance. And you have a bunch of different weights and a bunch of string lengths, and they get to trial and error sort of the optimal solution for the problem. We don't need the specifics of that, but there's all sorts of these types of tasks where they give you a bunch of variables, a bunch of things you can manipulate, and they look at the process that you use. And often we end up seeing that they'll follow a very structured way of trying all of the possibilities. This next slide is looking at identity development. And this one kind of hasn't connected to anything else, so we're just talking about it here before we move on towards that transitioning to adulthood. But I suppose we can connect it in that having an identity, having this knowledge of who you are and what you are and how you fit into society is definitely important for that transition into becoming a fully functioning adult. But with this theory here, this was originally proposed by James Marcia in the 1980s, and they thought that we'd have these 4 different statuses, and it's all based on exploration and commitment. So exploration is, have you looked into all of the possibilities? Have you tried thinking about all of these different ways that you can be or who you can be? We then also have our commitment, and this is, are you set on your identity or are you willing to keep changing? And so all of these combinations, we can have individuals who they maybe have a foreclosed identity. So in this case, they would have prematurely decided who they are because they didn't really look around to see if their decision is the best for them. So this could be somebody who has gone with whatever default identity they were given, maybe by their parents. They become who their parents expected them to be, or they've become whatever was expected of them in high school or something like that. So they didn't do a ton of exploration, and they've settled, they've committed to that identity without looking into other options. We can have this identity diffusion period where you haven't made any decisions, but you also haven't looked into possibilities. So maybe you're not ready to settle on an identity because you haven't looked into things. We can run into this psychosocial moratorium, which is their fancy way of saying that people are in that exploration process. They haven't committed to anything. What they're doing right now is looking at their possibilities, trying out different identities before they settle. So this is that exploration and growth period where they figure out what works. So this could be things like going to university or college, trying different classes, maybe going to different jobs and seeing if you like this job or if you should try something else. So lots of that exploration. And then the last, and this was Marcia's sort of goal in mind, where people should strive to end up, is identity achievement, where you've settled after that high level of exploration. You looked into it, you found who you are, what your best decision is, and that's where you've settled. You now have your identity.